to this webinar where we try to find ways to combat forced labor.
And I'd just like to give you
a few practical notes to start with. We have English and German available, and you may switch from English to German if you prefer to follow discussion in German. And for questions to panelists, please use the Q&A function in the application. And for technical issues and other comments, you may use the chat function indeed. So let's look into the purpose of this event today. It's the first webinar of this kind that the international cluster of the Greens European Free Alliance group hosts. And we decided to tackle the issue of modern slavery. And we know that the most common form of modern slavery is forced labor. Even today, and we can count as much as 25 million people who are estimated to be in forced labor around the world. And even if we don't want it, products and services made through forced labor are often sold and marketed in the European markets. So unwillingly, we consume and contribute to this exploitation. And today we discuss how we can end this ugly situation. The European Parliament has several times called for a new European Union instrument that would allow an import ban on products related to forced labor. Consequently, the European Commission is now considering effective action and enforcement mechanisms to ensure that forced labor does not find a place in the value chains of EU companies. The most effective way to address modern slavery and forced labor, to me, seems to be an ambitious and efficient European Union mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence legislation, which is underway. This legislation, we expect the Commission's proposal in the early autumn. It would put in place a general corporate duty to respect human rights and the environment, and an obligation to companies to undertake human rights and environmental due diligence throughout their value chains. And I'd like to mention that in the European Parliament's report from March 2021, where we have designed this due diligence instrument, we also call for complementary measures, such as the prohibition of the importation of products related to severe human rights violations, such as forced labor and child labor. Due diligence obligation alone may not be sufficient, and we need to look into other ways, namely on import controls and import bans, which could be a powerful and a needed supplementary instrument as the Parliament. And also, by the way, the EU Council has referred to the need to put in place zero tolerance policy on child and forced labor in December 2020. So what then could be done? We definitely feel that there is a case when forced labor is not something a certain company resorts to, but something organized by the state itself, and this does happen. In these situations, it may be impossible for companies to perform due diligence. In these situations, companies' leverage is simply not enough. Therefore, there is a need for the urgent introduction of import controls and import bans in response to state-imposed and other large-scale violations of environment and human rights. It is needed so that the EU can live up to its promise and ensure forced labor does not find a place in the value chains of EU companies or in the shopping baskets of EU citizens. And lastly, I'd like to mention the often repeated call by the European Parliament that there should be public access to customs data in order for EU citizens and other citizens and entities to find out which companies are importing and what to the EU. This data is accessible in the United States, but not in the EU. So one of the inspirations of this webinar was that my colleague Anna Cavazzini has commissioned a report on how to combat forced labor. And the report will be presented later in the webinar. But now I'd like to give the floor to Valdis Dombrovskis, Executive Vice President of the European Commission. Executive Vice President Dombrovskis is responsible for the economy that works for the people and in this capacity, he also leads DG Trade. So, Mr. Dombrovskis, thank you very much for agreeing to speak to us, and the floor is now yours.
Honorable Mrs. Hautala, honorable members, first of all, thank you for this introduction and for this opportunity to discuss today the issue of forced labor. Indeed, this meeting is particularly timely because earlier today the Commission published its new business guidance on forced labor. This delivers on the commitment made in the trade policy strategy published earlier this year. The business guidance will help EU companies to adapt their due diligence procedures. It will assist them to identify, prevent, mitigate, and account for the risk of forced labor in their supply chains. The Commission is therefore supporting our companies to pursue due diligence procedures in line with the UN, ILO, and OECD standards. Today's guidance is meant to raise awareness and to support companies in their implementation of existing international standards on due diligence. It places a particular focus on actions to identify and address the risks of forced labor in their operations and supply chains. However, it does not create new obligations for businesses. The guidance bridges the gap until the sustainable corporate governance legislation is in place. This is the second part of our headline action on forced labor. This legislation, which we'll present in autumn, should introduce mandatory due diligence obligations on EU companies. Subject to the impact assessment, this will include effective action and enforcement mechanisms to ensure that forced labor does not find a place in their value chains. Here, I would like to thank Greens EFA Group and in particular Anna Cavazzini for all the work that you had been doing on company due diligence and in particular on forced labor. Strengthening the resilience and sustainability of EU supply chains is at the core of the new EU trade strategy, including our plans to tackle forced labor. We know the facts. An estimated 25 million people are in forced labor globally, and women and girls are disproportionately affected. Abolishing the use of forced labor and defending human rights are priorities for the European Commission. Of course, this requires coordinated action across different policies. Trade policy alone will not solve all human rights and sustainable development issues in the world, but we should make every effort to ensure it is fulfilling its role to the maximum. The sustainable development chapters in our modern trade deals are already playing a vital role. They include binding commitments from our partners to ratify and effectively implement all fundamental ILO conventions. Indeed, this is a unique feature of EU trade agreements. These conventions include an obligation to suppress the use of forced labor or compulsory labor of all forms. This commitment extends to the countries benefiting from the special incentive arrangement under the EU's general system of preferences, but it's not only about countries benefiting from GSP+. All 71 countries benefiting from GSP, including the standard arrangement, are obliged to uphold the principles of the fundamental ILO conventions. Violations of these commitments could lead to a temporary withdrawal of GSP tariff preferences. Here, let me say a special word of recognition to Ms. Heidi Hautala for her long-standing efforts in this area. After the summer, we will propose a review of general system of preferences, and one of the objectives of the GSP reform will be to strengthen its contribution to sustainable development, including labor standards. So I look forward for working with European Parliament on this. In line with the 15-point action plan of February 2018, we have made important efforts to improve implementation and enforcement of TSD commitments. We have seen a clear push to be more assertive in this respect. In the case of Korea, we resorted to the bilateral dispute settlement mechanism. The panel of experts published its report in January this year. The panel agreed with the EU's assertion that Korean trade union legislation was not consistent with the principles of freedom of association. The panel also expected Korea to ratify expeditiously all 4 outstanding fundamental ILO conventions. And Korea is already delivering on its commitments, having ratified 3 out of 4 outstanding conventions after the panel report. The Korean example shows that a more assertive approach can deliver real, meaningful results, which is why a stronger focus on assertiveness is one of the 3 pillars of the new trade strategy. Important new initiatives like creation of the Chief Trade Enforcement Officer and the single entry point all contribute to this goal. But we recognize that more needs to be achieved. Europe's approach to trade policy is evolving. This is why I decided to bring forward the review of the TSD action plan to this year. Just over a month ago, we launched a comparative study on how other countries implement and enforce TSD provisions in their own free trade agreements. We want to learn more from their experience. And in the autumn, we will have an opportunity to discuss with all interested stakeholders the first results of the study. Before the summer, we will launch an open public consultation on the TSD action plan review. Its scope will be broad. For example, it will seek stakeholders' views on remedies for breaching TSD provisions, including sanctions. I know this is an important priority for honorable members, and I want to assure that we are making steady progress. The review will take a critical look at all relevant aspects of trade and sustainable development. It will identify where additional action may be necessary, particularly on the implementation and enforcement side. We expect to conclude the review in the first half of next year. More broadly, the Commission will adopt a communication on decent work worldwide to take forward the social dimension in all its international action. Forced labor is a global blight, and eradicating it will require a global effort. International action and coordination are therefore paramount. International fora have a central role to play. We are cooperating with our partners at the G7 level to ensure that global supply chains are free from the use of forced labor. This includes making the best possible use of our own domestic means, as well as strengthening the role of multilateral institutions. We have also taken note of forced labor measures in several like-minded countries. We will keep working together and share best practices on how to address forced labor in global supply chains. We will identify areas for strengthened cooperation ahead of the G7 Trade Ministerials meeting in October. To conclude, honourable members, I look forward for maintaining an open dialogue with the European Parliament to address all these questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Executive Vice President Dombrovskis. We're going to follow your keynote with a panel now that I have the honor of moderating. And the panel will first start with Anna Cavazzini, who has already been mentioned several times, presenting the Greens EFA study and giving a perspective from the European Parliament for about 7 minutes. Then we would want to have you, Executive Vice President, reacting to the Green proposal, maybe in some detail. And after that, we will continue the exchange. And I already would like to ask for everybody's understanding that the Executive Vice President cannot stay with us all the time. We will continue the exchange in the panel with Andy Hall and Chloe Cranston, whom I will introduce more extensively in a few minutes. But in order not to squander the precious time, I just want to say that so far there are 2 countries, namely the United States of America and Canada, that have put in place regulation to ban the import of products of forced labor. And now the question is whether we will be successful in doing just the same. And Anna Cavazzini, please give us the idea of how that could be achieved. Yours the floor.
Yeah, thank you, Reinhard, and also Heidi for the introduction. Also, thanks from my side to Commissioner Dombrovskis to being here with us. It's really very good to have this exchange of views. We also see there's a high interest amongst the audience, so a very, very hot topic when we discuss about forced labor and what to do with this. And I think also the overview, Mr. Dombrovskis, that you gave shows already that the Commission and the EU as a whole is very active already. But nevertheless, as you mentioned, there is still 25 million people in forced labor worldwide. And of course, this is much more than most consumers think. All kind of products may be linked to forced labor, for example, textiles or tomatoes or solar panels. So often as consumers, we don't even know that we buy products that are linked to forced labor. Like one very shocking and clear example to probably illustrate a little bit more of what we are talking about. Some wigs that were produced in China and imported abroad were found to have been produced by forced labor of the Uyghur ethnic minority in internment camps in Xinjiang. And not only produced by them, but also some of their hair itself is believed to be in the wigs. And there was reported basically forced hair removal, which is really, really scary and crazy. And while this may be the case only for a few wigs in the world for a very small quantity, it is outrageous that we at the moment don't really have a tool to stop them when they come on the European market and on the internal market. And just to not only mention the Uyghurs and China, of course, this is a huge problem. This is often the emblematic cases, but there is also forced labors in other parts of the world. I'm sure that Andy Hall later will also talk about this, for example, the case of Malaysia. So we talked about it, and Heidi mentioned it in the introduction, the Parliament, and this was the initiative of the Greens EFA group, decided already several times that we would like to have basically another additional tool for the European Union to tackle this problem. When we had the discussions about the mandatory due diligence report, the Lara Walters report, we had basically pushed through or negotiated in an amendment that exactly called for an additional instrument on a forced labor import ban. And I think this is very important. It is now the position of the European Parliament. Just to go a little bit more in detail on this study that we commissioned, we tried to just examine different options of how this could be organized. And we came indeed to the conclusion, and that is why, of course, we invited you, Mr. Dombrovskis, also today, that a trade legal basis as an additional tool to the company law, the due diligence, would be the best, basically, legal basis and the best means of how to go forward with such an instrument. And we, of course, also looked at the US on how they are doing it and try to learn also a little bit from them, what is working at the US, what is not working, and trying to adapt this for our basically proposal. So I think it is rightly so what you mentioned, dear Mr. Dombrovskis, that there is several tools, for example, the GSP, the TSD chapters in trade agreements and other tools. And I think it's really, really welcome that the Commission is working on all of those, trying to improve the effectiveness of the social dimension, of the sustainable dimension in trade agreements, for example. But yeah, nevertheless, of course, it is interesting to also look at a new instrument. We had a close look at this business advisory on forced labor that you published today and that you also mentioned, and I think it's already a very big step forward that companies get guidance, because when we speak to companies, they sometimes also say they don't know how to approach the topic. They also don't want to have forced labors in their supply chain. So I think that the Commission comes up with new guidance for businesses to help them is quite welcome. But of course, we have seen in the due diligence debate that often voluntary measures are not enough. So probably just two concrete questions to you, so that you can answer before you have to run off in your busy schedule. How are the considerations of an additional instrument being conducted at the moment within the Commission? There is this impact assessment being undertaken that you mentioned. Probably you can go a little bit more in detail on the discussions, on how the impact assessment is being designed, of what you expect. And with that, I hand over again to Reinhard.
Thank you very much, Anna. And I immediately turn back to Executive Vice President Dombrovskis, because I want to give you the chance, sir, to react to Anna's explanations about what we would want to shoot for. Please.
Yes, thank you very much for this presentation, and indeed it contains valuable ideas for our reflection and consideration. So also in a sense a question how to address the forced labor, but how to also address the goods themselves, because I think we all agree that goods produced with forced labor have no place in the EU single market. At the same time, we must recognize the difficulties our companies sometimes face to identify forced labor risks in their supply chains. It's not always possible to pinpoint if forced labor has contributed to a particular good, and it's exacerbated by the fact that supply chains in many cases extend to multiple third countries and contractors and subcontractors. Therefore, indeed, it's our joint challenge to identify most effective and proportionate way to tackle forced labor issues. So we already discussed about our today's guidance, but indeed our guidance is not the end of the story. It's only part of our approach, and basically bridging the gap until mandatory due diligence comes into force. So what we are doing now, indeed, we are doing the assessment and preparing the sustainable corporate governance proposal. It's still being impact assessed. But it's true that due diligence and a prohibition actually go hand in hand. The company that has effective due diligence procedures in place should be in a strong position to eradicate forced labor in supply chains, and a prohibition, whether it's limited to imports or to extended to surveillance of all goods in a single market, would serve to address those instances where due diligence has not been sufficient. So clearly the two issues are linked, and any additional legislation introducing an import prohibition will interact with sustainable corporate governance legislation. So that's why right now we indeed are looking at all angles, how to ensure effective enforcement through due diligence and on possible additional tools. Currently under the impact assessment, it's still open whether we do in a framework of sustainable corporate governance legislation, or we come with a separate legislative proposal. This is still open, and there are, in a sense, pluses and minuses on both approaches. But of course, it's true that if we now would come with a new import prohibition tool, that would require new legislative process, once again with impact assessment, public consultation. In a sense, it would take longer time to materialize. So that's what we are looking, to which extent it can actually be done through the due diligence legislation. So that's, I would say, the current state of play. So once again, thank you very much for this invitation, for this exchange of views, and we will, from the Commission side, maintain an open and constructive dialogue and see how we best move these issues forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vice President. If you allow me just to, for a minute and a half, basically, to insist on one question. You've clarified that you're not excluding an extra instrument. There are two options, as you said, but you have not pointed at the possible example, and there I would want to challenge you, of the United States, where through the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, legislators have reversed the burden of proof. So in a challenging case, the importer would have to prove that products have not been produced with forced labor. Are you looking into that, or are you excluding that?
Well, on this, I already mentioned the cooperation and coordination of this work with US and other like-minded partners, and that this is something which can be also part of the upcoming G7 trade ministerial meeting. So I would say it's not that we are excluding at current stage anything. We are looking at what approaches other countries are applying and seeing what of this can be used also in the case of the EU, and how we ensure to the extent globally coordinated approach. So in short, we are definitely not excluding this possibility.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for participating, Executive Vice President, and we're looking forward to continuing a fruitful cooperation with yourself and the Commission. We'll let you go now to attend to your other duties, and want to introduce the remaining two panelists that I have already announced. Andy Hall and Chloe Cranston. Andy has lived in several Asian countries, particularly spent a lot of time in Thailand, and been an activist that specialized on issues around migrant workers' rights and migrant workers' concerns. He was an international affairs advisor also to the Myanmar government and Aung San Suu Kyi. He has been an international affairs advisor to the Migrant Worker Rights Network. Today he lives in Nepal and is still dealing with this kind of issues, and we're welcoming him very much to now take the floor. And but before you do, Andy, let me also introduce Chloe, who is a business and human rights manager at the Anti-Slavery International. Chloe leads Anti-Slavery International's work to address forced labor in global supply chains through advocacy and direct engagement with businesses. So Andy first, and then Chloe, please.
Thank you very much, especially to Anna and to Heidi, who I've worked very closely with on this issue for a number of years and hope to continue to do so once I can finally get to Brussels sometime in the future. So my journey on these issues actually started in 2018 when the US government, particularly the Customs and Border Protection Department, modified their regulations and their laws to remove a consumptive demand presumption from their law, which allowed the US government to import goods that were made through forced labor when there was a consumptive demand in the country. So in 2015, that was changed, and we started to see the US government more aggressively enforcing these laws in 2018, at a time when I was in Malaysia, looking particularly at issues of rubber gloves. And so the US government has regulations which prohibit the importation of merchandise that is mined, produced, or manufactured wholly or in part in any foreign country by forced or indentured labor. And this includes child forced labor. And that merchandise is subject to an exclusion from the US market and seizure. And it can also lead to a criminal investigation of the importers of those goods. So when there is information that reasonably, but not conclusively, indicates that forced labor is present, including child forced labor, the CPB, the Customs and Border Protection Department, under the Homeland Securities, they can order, it's called a withhold release order, which means essentially these goods cannot enter into the US. And they can also issue something called a finding when there is more concrete information to support that. And with limited exceptions, until today, actually, mostly the focus has been on actually preventing goods coming into the US, as opposed to criminalizing or taking action against the importers. So this is a very important tool, which a lot of people talk about, but also the Canadian government has been developing a similar tool under the US-Mexico-Canada Free Trade Agreement. So we have two systems now, and I myself have made multiple petitions, both to the US and to the Canadian, as a very important advocacy tool and a very crucial weapon that can be used in an activist's armory to actually bring change to an industry. And it's something which is really a game changer, and it has really been incredibly beneficial to workers. And I'll speak just briefly about that because there's a very a short time limit. And I want to contrast this with this situation in, for instance, in the EU, the world's largest trade bloc, in the UK, in Australia, where essentially there is just words. You know, there is actually no mechanism by which we can prevent these goods coming into blocks like the EU, in contrast to the US and Canada. And I want to give the example of, for instance, in gloves, which I'm working on in Malaysia, systemic forced labor. And in fact, the EU ambassador to Malaysia was asking during the pandemic for 24/7 production of gloves without even mentioning issues relating to forced labor. And we really see that the EU it's really at a weakness, and it comes across in some ways as the EU prioritizing trade and consumption over human rights of workers and communities. And it really sends a bad message, a poor message and an ineffective message to the global community that the EU is not prioritizing these issues of forced labor. Actually, the EU system, the CPB system, it's got some weaknesses which I will deal with briefly, but I want to focus on the case of gloves. I've worked with the US government, as I said, from 2018 to ensure sanctions against two Malaysian gloves companies. One was a smaller company with absolutely terrible conditions, and one was the world's largest glove producer, Top Glove. And as a result of these cases, you know, we petitioned the US government with multiple documents, photographs, videos, worker pay slips, worker testimonies, and we collected this evidence to show that there was systemic forced labor according to the ILO's 11 indicators. And the US government blocked those goods under a withhold release order and eventually a finding. And that action by the US has led to almost over 150 million ringgit in remediation to workers of recruitment fees that they had paid in the past. And that's almost about over $40 million that was paid back to the workers when the company was trying to end the situation of forced labor within its operations and try to get the ban lifted. And we've seen a massive change in this company as a result of the sanctions, and also a huge deterrent impact on the whole industry, who fear that they may face these sanctions next. And it's really been an incredibly powerful tool. And again, this happened during the pandemic. So it happened at a time when the US and the world were completely dependent on Malaysia, that produces 70% of the gloves. But still, the US was willing to focus on this company and willing to say, look, forced labor issues are not acceptable, and they come before our consumptive demand needs. And that is a very important message that the US has given to the world. I think just to look at I think the EU is in a really unique position whereby actually they can learn a lot from the US system, and also the system that the Canadians are developing, because the Canadians are also having a lot of difficulties in developing this system. But I just want to highlight very briefly some challenges. One is that the sanctions need to focus also on the importers, and those who don't practice due diligence, those that are complicit in forced labor. They cannot just focus on the suppliers and banning the goods of suppliers. There needs to be sanctions on the importers, including criminal and civil sanctions, which rarely we've seen in the US. There also needs to be a duty to remediate, and I know there were some questions coming up here in the chat box. You know, it's no good having a protectionist approach, which again was the basis of the US laws, whereby we just stop the goods coming in. There has to be a focus also on remediation and prevention, not protectionist measures. And we've seen, for instance, in one of the cases that I've worked on, where workers actually, for a very brief period of time, were put in a terrible disadvantage by the sanctions that were imposed on a company. So we really need to focus on remediation also. And we also need predictability, can increase the deterrent impact of the sanctions. You know, the US government now is in quite a unique position whereby they're sanctioning the main glove company in Malaysia, Top Glove, even though it's not the worst company anymore in Malaysia. So we have companies that are committing more egregious breaches of the human rights of workers, and these companies are still not sanctioned. And we do need to have a more uniform and consistent enforcement, because, you know, if we don't have clear rules, if we don't have strong and certain enforcement, you know, uniform enforcement, if we don't have clarity as to what is required of companies, it actually reduces the deterrent impact of the law. And the CPB's current approach is really create some kind of market inequalities and unfair competition. So I think, you know, just to summarize, the EU can learn a lot from the US and the Canadian challenges that they've faced in developing these systems quite piecemeal, systems that have been incredibly effective for activists like myself, for human rights defenders, for civil society, in bringing massive change to workers. And again, I want to stress that, you know, the sanctions in the US government against Top Glove resulted in over $40 million being paid back to workers, which is outstanding, without a court system, without going through years of a court process. But this measure does need to exist alongside mandatory human rights due diligence processes. You know, it's complementary. And also, as Heidi mentioned very briefly in the beginning, the good thing about the US is that we have access to the US customs data, and we can link the abuses that are happening with the customs data of things that are going into the US, where the EU obviously doesn't have any publicly available customs data, and that really weakens the approach. So we do need both mandatory human rights due diligence, forced labor legislation to combat and to prevent these goods coming into the EU borders, but we also need more transparent and open customs data to ensure that activists and others can actually link the abuses that are going on in these countries, in these establishments, with the EU market. And for that, we do need the transparent customs data.
Thank you, Andy. Chloe, would you give us your perspective, please?
Thank you. My perspective is quite similar to those we've heard so far from Heidi, Andy, and others. So I'll just try and cover maybe some additional points as well. Thank you very much to everyone for inviting me to speak today. It's been really interesting to hear the reflections so far. For anyone who doesn't know, Anti-Slavery International is considered the oldest human rights organization in the world, over 180 years old. Our approach is to address all contemporary forms of slavery, and in particular a focus on the root causes of slavery. To do so, we believe that all governments must have a strong policy framework that addresses the root causes of forced labor. And within such a framework, we would put on the table, for example, mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence, import controls, trade and development policy, understanding the need for all of these measures to be taken. I'll speak in a summarized way, but to flag that we recently published a position paper on this exact topic with the European Centre for Constitutional and Human Rights, and I can put a link to that in the chat once I finish speaking. So where we see import controls coming into this framework is essentially where human rights and environmental due diligence on the ground is effectively impossible, as Heidi has already mentioned. And this is in particular the case of state-imposed forced labor. We also see it as an additional strong and supplementary enforcement measure to further compel meaningful preventive and remedial actions by both EU and non-EU companies importing goods onto the EU market, where their current actions on forced labor are wholly insufficient and remedies urgently required. If I take state-imposed forced labor, first, it's been mentioned, but these are examples where due diligence on the ground isn't possible. We see this in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, but also in Turkmenistan, which also has a state-imposed forced labor system in cotton harvesting. These are scenarios where companies cannot claim to be undertaking due diligence on the ground credibly. The only way they can do human rights due diligence is to map their suppliers and exit any sourcing and any links with complicit suppliers. In such instances, we do need urgent import bans on products from the Uyghur region and from Turkmenistan, which both exist in the US. So I really welcome the Executive Vice President's recognition of the urgent need to not have a slow process to introduce import controls. I'd also like to pick up on the Executive Vice President's comment about the complexity and challenges for companies to identify forced labor through their supply chains. This is true, but it's also because of the way that companies have structured globalized supply chains to evade visibility and responsibility with series of contractors, subcontractors, agencies, traders, and so on. A strong enforcement measure like import controls would compel companies to urgently undertake measures to trace their supply chains and to know their supply chains. And I can tell you from my personal conversations with companies around the Uyghur cotton ban in the US, this is what has been happening. But unfortunately, it's taken a situation of crimes against humanity and a withhold release order for them to take this action to know where their cotton comes from. We should have seen that happening beforehand. Another reason for the urgency for import controls in the EU is the point about jurisdiction hopping. What we're also seeing happening is while the US introduces withhold release orders or import bans, companies can simply turn around ships. So instead of going to the US and importing goods into the US, they can instead import them into markets which do not have import bans. We saw that last year with Malaysia, as Andy's mentioned, and we're also seeing that on Uyghur region cotton. So the EU does not want itself to be essentially what we can call a dumping ground for forced labor goods. Then it's essential that the EU, but also all governments introduce such measures. So companies can't pick and choose jurisdictions which allow them to import slavery-made goods. However, I also want to highlight that we do need to see this beyond state-imposed forced labor. We're calling for the use of import controls over particular factories, farms, vessels, or from groups of factories, farms, or fleets, such as in the US recently introduced a ban on an entire Chinese fleet complicit in forced labor and seafood. Also from particular importers or groups of importers, and similarly from entire industries. Beyond state-imposed forced labor, we flag that import controls, how they will work and how they should be introduced per withhold release order should vary across the type of import control, the scenario, and also the EU market's consumption of said goods, which will have some impact on the so-called unintended consequences. This emphasizes, in our view, the need for impact assessments and, crucially, consultation with trade unions, NGOs, and credible representatives of potentially affected stakeholders, such as the amazing work of Andy Hall. In such context, we really believe that engagement with trade unions and worker representatives are important and vital to ensure the urgent provision of remedy so that we see that positive outcome at the end for workers, as Andy has mentioned. A few final points from me. Some caution that we would give that import controls are suitable for forced labor, but we caution against them on child labor. And here I want to distinguish between child labor and the forced labor of children. They are two different things and two different scenarios, and the perpetrators are very different. On child labor, we see this unintended consequences as potentially too high, considering the impact this could have on families. And in this, we instead believe the appropriate response is around trade policy, development policy, and due diligence legislation, looking at issues such as land rights and access to education and poverty. And finally, I had a few points to make about how to improve upon the US approach, which currently lacks transparency, has issues around remedy and so on. However, Andy has already mentioned quite a few of them. So instead, I'll leave it there and happy to answer any more questions in Q&A.
Thank you very much indeed, Chloe. That brings us to the last part of this event, where we're going to address questions being asked under the Q&A function. And I will read the questions. Some are quite specific, and I would hope that our panelists would take, well, basically 4 minutes each, let's say 3 minutes each, to answer the question. And I would give precedence to Chloe and Andy, and would then end the responses with Anna, who can then also make a few concluding remarks. So let's start with the questions that have been posted. One question went to EVP Dombrovskis about the cooperation with the US. He shortly addressed that. Another question says, the US introduced this law about a century ago, more to protect their national market against unfair business competition with countries with low wages and using forced labor. I think Andy already addressed the issue of protectionism. Then the same participant goes on. My question is how the new regulations will help workers in forced labor to improve their conditions. Do you consider any remediation and instrument to improve labor conditions? An anonymous attendee asks, one of the biggest issues for companies is where the burden of proof will lie to show there is no forced labor in the product. Most companies use certifications, audits, but there are some credibility gaps with some of them. What level of evidence would companies be expected to show? Judy Gerhard asks, in order to ensure remediation, there is some discussion in the US of increasing punitive fines and creating a fund to support remediation of victims. But of course, that cannot be done by the CBP. So what options are there to establish a system in the EU wherein the enforcement bodies would be distinct from the remediation body? Then more questions, again from an anonymous attendee to Chloe. Why can't companies sourcing products from regions such as Xinjiang not practice due diligence by definition? Isn't this unfair towards such companies, considering that many of them might not practice forced labor at all? And another anonymous to Andy, which companies from Malaysia will be in the WRO soon? When, in your view, can top glove be lifted? Thank you. And the final 2 questions are from Sarah. Can you please tell us more about how a forced labor import ban diverts those same goods to other markets? To what extent would banning access to the EU market create change on the ground? And the last one from Vashti. How does forced labor legislation encompass forced prison labor? 3 minutes each. Chloe, would you go first and pick the ones that you want to answer, and then Andy and Anna in the end, please.
Thank you. I think I'll just pick up on 2 points really briefly. First, on the remedy question. If you read our position paper with ECCHR, we have considered quite in depth the issue around unintended consequences, which Andy has also mentioned. And there's two approaches we recommend there. One is the need for impact assessments before introducing any WRO. And in such an impact assessment, it needs to be considered and found a solution as to how to ensure that urgent provision of remedy. So that approach is in place from the very beginning. And again, I just would push the role of trade unions and credible representatives of workers being very central to this process. The other approach that we're putting forward is the idea of grace periods. This is something that some US civil society groups suggested to the US CBP on proposed WRO on US importers of cocoa goods. And essentially it would give importers or manufacturers weeks or potentially months in order to urgently provide remedy and introduce corrective measures. And if such measures were not introduced, then the WRO would be put in place. And by introducing this kind of grace period, we believe it could give that time to ensure that urgent provision of remedy while avoiding the so-called unintended consequences. However, it very much depends on the scenario, whether that's appropriate, and in some scenarios it wouldn't be appropriate and urgent WROs would be needed. In particular, state-imposed forced labor is one. There's no arguments that can be made about unintended consequences on state-imposed forced labor and WROs. And if I go to that, the anonymous attendee who's asked about the Uyghur region, the reason why companies sourcing from the Uyghur region cannot practice due diligence on the ground by definition is because of the level of persecution and surveillance. There's absolutely no credible means that companies can credibly verify an absence of forced labor. And even if they manage to find out what's going on the ground and identified forced labor, there's no preventative, no mitigation, and no remedy approaches they can take there, so they have to leave. And I would flag that this has been recognized by audit companies themselves. Last September, 6 or 7 global audit companies announced that they would no longer conduct audits in the region due to the lack of credibility and safety to do so. So it's not just workers at risk, but it's also inspectors. Thank you. Apologies if I missed any questions. I'm also very happy to follow up by email, and I can put my email in chat.
Well, thanks a lot, Chloe. Andy, please, your answers.
I just want to focus actually on the question about, when an import ban is imposed on a company. Actually, we saw with Top Glove, when the import ban was imposed by the US government, we saw an increase in the products being sent to the EU. And actually, we saw recently a statement from the company saying that they were diverting a lot of their products to the EU market because of the US ban. And that was a real, disappointment, to hear that goods that were being blocked from the US were being sent to the EU because there was no legislation in place. And I think that was really, it shows the need to have a uniform approach across the globe. Related to these issues of audits, and again, this is very much an issue for the mandatory human rights due diligence issue. The audits have shown themselves again and again to be completely ineffective. If we look at the situation in the gloves, there was over a decade of audits that were not picking up any of this forced labor, and essentially these audits were going on for years. They weren't uncovering issues like passport confiscation, debt bondage, workers being confined to their accommodation, to their jobs, being unable to resign. And we really saw the failure of auditing companies. And I think that definitely this kind of legislation on forced labor also needs to exist alongside looking and reconsidering on civil and criminal penalties against auditors. And those that are involved in failing to uncover these kind of abuses. That's also a very important issue. I think a lot of people talk about the remediation issue. And again, I just want to stress that for the EU, it really is crucial that these measures come across as something that protects victims and are not protectionist, as I've already said. And I think that we really need to focus on how to ensure that. And I think that also, if we look at some of the issues that the Canadian government now are breaching, should should employers, should companies be given a chance to respond? What should be the standards imposed? There's a lot of issues that are now being dealt with by the Canadian government. So I think definitely the EU can consider all of these approaches, the strengths and weaknesses, and come up with something that is much needed to ensure. But I just want to stress, with the CPB's approach in Malaysia, it has resulted in massive change across the whole gloves industry. I think almost $120 million now has been paid back to workers in debt, in recruitment debt. Tens of thousands of workers have got their passports back. Workers have had their contracts changed to ensure freedom of movement. Working hours to some extent have reduced even during a pandemic in some companies. But we still have really terrible abuses that are going on in the Malaysian gloves industry with companies that are not subject to sanctions. And that has really shown the weakness and the lack of consistency in the US approach, which is something that the EU does need to consider in moving forward, how to have a more consistent, fair, non-discriminatory approach to ensure these sanctions are used fairly and with due process and according to the rule of law, because sometimes we can suspect political agendas when sanctions are imposed on companies when there's not consistency.
Thank you also very much, Andy. It's encouraging to hear from you that such action, if it is indeed taken, can result in some very practical, measurable improvement on the ground. This is what we're obviously seeking. Just adding a short remark to what Chloe said about Xinjiang. Last year in February, more than 80 global brands and companies were accused by the Australian Security Policy Institute of benefiting from forced labor. I spoke to several other European companies under scrutiny there. And even though some of them really made considerable efforts to avoid being involved in forced labor schemes, basically all of them said that they could not guarantee that they are not somehow connected through their value chains indirectly to forced labor schemes. And another remark I wanted to make, of course, if a European company produces, let's say in Xinjiang, just for the local market, a ban on the importation of forced labor wouldn't help. So that would be a loophole at which we would have to possibly look with other tools. But Anna, it's now time for your concluding remarks. Please sew it all together and wrap it all up.
Yeah, thank you, Reinhard. I think what we clearly saw today or listened to today is that a lot of things are in movement when it comes to combating forced labor and modern slavery, and that we have a huge window of opportunity. We have the recent G7 conclusions that are also committing to tackle forced labor. We have more and more legislation around the world, also sometimes to individual regions, but nevertheless. And we have the discussions going on in the European Parliament and, of course, also in the European Union as a whole. And this is, I think, very promising. What we saw today, that it is not only important for tackling forced labor, but also to create a so-called legal level playing field, where some countries have legislation in place and the EU basically cannot be a safe harbor for forced labor products. I think we learned that also we as a European Union having the unique chance of profiting from legislation that is already in place and probably avoiding some of the mistakes that have been happening and having a very big focus on the victims and how to help also the victims and not having protectionist measures in place. So these, I think, are some of the key takeaways for me. I see what is very good that we have huge interest in this webinar, a lot of people from civil society, but also from different stakeholders. And I think it is also important to spread the word, because autumn will be decisive. This is what we just learned. The Commission is at the moment not decided yet, so they will decide in autumn. And I think the more we also talk about this, the more civil society gets active, the more we have a public debate, but also, of course, companies who are interested in not basically dealing with forced labor and tidying up their supply chains, that we all create some noise and some movement around it, and probably in autumn have some interesting proposals by the Commission. What I can assure you, and I think Reinhard and Heidi can probably agree to that we Greens, IFA and the European Parliament are obviously pushing for that. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Heidi, Anna, Chloe, and Andy. And let me just point you all to Twitter, where Valdis Dombrovskis has posted his remarks. So if you want to go back and read what he said, you will find that on Twitter. Thanks to everybody. Thanks to all the participants. I wish you a nice evening, and we'll be back to the topic, as Anna said. Bye-bye.